Hello you guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be my ranking the palettes I used in March by use. I have been filming this series all year long and I've been having so much fun kind of tracking the amount of times that I use, well, how many palettes I use each month, and then like how many palettes I use only one time a month versus 2 times, etc, etc. And I like tracking the amount of times that I use my eyeshadow palettes. One, because I do No Pan Left Behind, and 2, I just kind of like to track my use. I feel like so frequently I say like, I love this palette so much, I use it all the time, but then like I look at my uses and I'm like, I literally use that palette 3 times. Like how can that be considered like all the time? So it kind of like keeps myself honest as well. And I'm actually kind of surprised. In March, I used the least amount of palettes in the month than I have all year. February has been the month that I used the most palettes. But in the month of March, I used a total of 32 eyeshadow palettes. And amongst those 32 eyeshadow palettes, I used 12 eyeshadow palettes 1 time, 10 eyeshadow palettes 2 times, 2 eyeshadow palettes 3 times, 3 eyeshadow palettes 4 times, 1 eyeshadow palette 5 times, 1 eyeshadow palette 6 times, 1 eyeshadow palette 7 times, 1 eyeshadow palette 18 times, and then 1 eyeshadow palette 22 times. So if you're interested in seeing all the palettes that I used throughout the month of March, stay tuned. That was not as dramatic as I thought it was gonna be. Stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I'd love for you to consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Alrighty, you guys, we are gonna start with the 12 eyeshadow palettes that I reached for just 1 time, and it's in no particular order other than the palettes are literally sitting in front of me. So up first, I have my Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 1, and if I can remember like what I reached into the palette for, I'll let you know. I really cannot remember what I reached into this eyeshadow palette for. I believe it was just 1 shade, and a part of me is like telling me it was the shade Resilient right here, but like I literally can't remember. So I'm so sorry, I don't remember, but I did reach into this palette 1 time. I also reached into my Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction palette 1 time, and I believe, I'm actually surprised I only reached into this once. Sometimes I'm like, girl, did you reach for something? And then like you forgot to mark it. And I will say sometimes with the Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction, it's like I'll be done with my eyeshadow look, I'll put all my things, I'm laughing to myself because I'm like, no, I'm not putting all my things away because I definitely don't clean up after myself every day. But like, I'll kind of like be done and then I'll decide like my green eyeshadow look, which I was wearing so much green throughout the month of March, needs like just a little something extra, and I'll pop this shade on top. And I swear I did that like at least 2 or 3 times, but I only tracked it once. So the shade that I know I reached for in this palette is this shade right here. I love this, just beautiful. There is just something like, I don't want to say there's not something special, but like there's just something special, but like also, is it really that special? To me it is. About this green shade in the Pat McGrath palette, I don't know if it's like the sparkly glitter flecks running throughout. I love it so much, and if I'm feeling like not even like a green eyeshadow palette is looking dull, if it is looking dull, this is a great thing to just pop on the lid to add a little something something. But if I just feel like it just needs something to like tie it all together, even like maybe it's just feeling like it's not all seamlessly tied together, I'll just pop the shadow on. And I love the way that this shadow in the Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction palette specifically just brings a green eyeshadow look together. So supposedly I only reached for that 1 time, but I swear I reached for more. I also, like, there's some random eyeshadow palettes that are like scattered throughout this, but I guess I reached for the Urban Decay Naked Honey palette once. I feel like I reached for this shade right here. And why I reached for this as a lid setting shade when I have another lid setting shade I'm focused on finishing up, I'm not sure, but I believe that is the shade that I reached for in here, and I have no idea why. Not a clue, but reached for that palette once. I also reached into my Adept Ninhydrin palette 1 time, and I thought for sure I knew which shade it was. I think it was the shade ACD 18. I was trying to see, I think I'm so close to pan on this shade right here. Or was it this shade or like one of these? I literally can't remember. I'm so sorry, you guys. Why am I like so terrible this month at remembering what I did? I also reached into the Odenseye Mighty Monster eyeshadow palette once. I'm still in my testing process for this, but I believe I reached for, or I did a look using just these 3 shades across the top, and I did like an everyday office appropriate look, and I really enjoyed it. So I'm excited to keep testing this, but I've only reached for this once thus far. I also reached into Pat McGrath Voyeuristic Vixen once. I reached this a couple times in February, and I finally finished No Pan Left Behinding this eyeshadow palette. Spoiler, we're ready to part ways. I'm ready to say bon voyage to that eyeshadow palette, but I used every shade. Okay, I pulled out my Going Coconuts eyeshadow palette because there was a day I just wanted like a very neutral base, and I was like, do I pull out ColourPop Going Coconuts or do I pull out Natasha Denona I Need a Nude? Natasha Denona I Need a Nude has gotten more use out of me this year, so I was like, I'm gonna pull out ColourPop Going Coconuts. And then I just like was not impressed at all. And I'm gonna declutter this. I have like swapped out 2 of the shades in here because these 2 shades that were here, Cocoa Crush and Da Cocoa, I decided I wanted to keep. I put them into a Sephora, not a Sephora. Why am I thinking of Sephora? I put them into a single eyeshadow palette, like a Z palette, and I grabbed, do I want this shade? No, it's quite dull. I grabbed 2 shades out of the ColourPop Get In Fresh palette that like I don't like that I put into this eyeshadow palette. So if I wanted to give this to like my mom or my sister, it's like a full palette of 9 shadows, but I'm over ColourPop Going Coconuts. Natasha Denona I Need a Nude has everything that I need when I want something like this. I did reach for the Oden's Eye Lil Ghost eyeshadow palette one time. I did a very purple look with this palette, and I had so much fun creating this. I am currently working on No Pan Left Behinding this eyeshadow palette in my whole collection project pan, so this will have some more use I anticipate next month, but I did only reach for this the one time in March. I did also bust out ABH Jackie in March. I went out one night to a new restaurant here in the cities area, and it was so much fun, and I busted out ABH Jackie because this palette always makes me feel pretty, fun, and confident. I actually did a look that was like a little bit different than what I normally do when I'm doing like my go-to look with this. I did a mixture of both Zam and Sponsored rather than just choosing one or the other, and I used these matte shades for my base, and I've really enjoyed the look, so I'll continue to reach for this, but I only reached for that once last month. I also busted out my Lawless The Glam One eyeshadow palette for a use this month, and I enjoyed my use with this. I was kind of thinking, like if I pull it out, am I excited to like try and No Pan Left Behind this, or is it something I'm considering decluttering? And I actually enjoyed my use with this, so that makes me happy. So I will try and now No Pan Left Behind this palette, but I only reached for it once. I reached for my LH Cosmetics Shimmer Saga eyeshadow palette, eyeshadow quad, one time this past month. I swear I also reached for this more than once, but I know that I created like a very neutral look and then used the shade Crush all over the eyes, which is this very like green sort of shade. I don't know how well you'll be able to see because I'm filming at like the worst time of day where outside is so bright. This actually is pretty similar to that shade out of the Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction palette, but Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction has more like limey green running throughout it, whereas the one from the LH Cosmetics palette has more of a transparent slash champagne base, and then is more of like a tealy kind of green, but yet still a green, not like a blue green. But anyway, I don't know where I'm going with that. I reached for that one time. Oh, my Gleminatrix Sugar and Spice palette is the 12th palette. I'm also just thinking to myself, what did I reach for in this eyeshadow palette? Maybe the shade Vanilla. I think I reached into Vanilla as an inner corner highlight. I'm like, what did I reach into? But also this is like lower down on my list, so this was like a recent reach. Oh my gosh, did you guys see that? Oh my gosh, my earring caught onto the magnet. That is too funny. And now I'm gonna try, oh yeah, look, okay, how fun. Anyway, reached for this one also one time. I do have a couple of ColourPop shades in here just because I didn't love the matte color story, and the little ColourPop singles or any ColourPop eyeshadow from any palette that you take out will fit into this. So if mine looks a little different, if my Sugar and Spice looks a little different than yours, that's why. Okay, I have 10 eyeshadow palettes that I reached for 2 total times, and we can start with a couple more ColourPop eyeshadow palettes that I am ready to part ways with. So I have ColourPop The Child. I'm just not impressed with the ColourPop not matte formula. Like, and it could be because I'm so into indie now and I am someone who likes something a little bit more punchy and metallic on the lids. I just don't feel like ColourPop gives me enough. It could be that this is an older palette, so perhaps the quality has declined, but I remember when I was first trying this eyeshadow palette too, I was a bit underwhelmed with some of the shimmer shades. So ColourPop the Child, I think, is going to be getting the boot during my next eyeshadow palette declutter, and I feel the exact same way about the ColourPop Tinkerbell eyeshadow palette. I pulled this out, I reached for this No Pan Left Behind, and I just was really, really underwhelmed with some of the looks that I created using this eyeshadow palette. So I think I'm ready to part ways with that. My Patrick Ta Major Dimension 2 eyeshadow palette. I know this is quite the controversial palette because of the fact that some people's are known to grow mold. I was a little uncertain as to whether or not mine was, but we're looking okay now. And I rolled this palette into my No Pan Left Behind. It took me 2 uses to reach for it No Pan Left Behind style. And I was reminded as to how incredible the Patrick Ta matte formula is. Like, in fact, do I actually need to get his all matte palette because his mattes are truly superb. And I loved both eyeshadow looks that I created using this eyeshadow palette. So I was really excited to pull this back out and get use out of it and love it like I remember loving it, because I feel like I forgot how much I loved it. I also reached into the Kaleidos Sashimi City eyeshadow palette 2 times. I reached for this some last month as well, and I have a new pan in this eyeshadow palette right up here, which makes me so happy because this is one of my all-time favorite eyeshadow palettes in my collection. So it just makes me happy to see pan in the palette because that tells me I've loved it, or I do love it, like I maybe think I love it because I've used it enough to get a pan. I have a couple other odenseye palettes. These I reached for twice. So up first I have my odenseye Norns eyeshadow palette, and the first time I used this, I used a mixture of these 2 shades right here as a nail polish. That is the nail polish I have on my nails right now. And then I reached for it one day just for the shade Green Chameleon with a like neutral look, and then I popped this all over the lid and I really enjoyed it. So happy to, I No Pan Left Behind did this early this year, and it always makes me feel good that I'm then, even after I've completed the palette, still reaching for it. And then I also reached into the odenseye Trick or Treat palette 2 times, and I reached into this eyeshadow palette, I believe once to use the shade Mummy's Curse as an inner corner highlight, and then I reached into Witch's Brew once as, actually I might have reached into Witch's Brew twice. Once on the eyes and then once as a nail polish. Such a fun nail polish, and I think I'm really close to hitting pan on the shade Witch's Brew, which is really exciting. It's such a fun green shade, so I know I'll continue to get use out of this. Speaking of Natasha Denona I Need a Nude, I reached for this eyeshadow palette twice this month. I believe both times I reached for this, I was just reaching for some of the matte shades to kind of create like a neutral base so that I could then go in with like a shimmery green shadow all over the lid, which is how I've kind of been reaching for this palette this year. I haven't reached for this palette like a lot in one month, but I've continued to reach for this palette a couple of times each month, so I'll be really curious to see how many uses this palette has at the end of the year, just because this is one that's always top of mind when I'm looking for just like a neutral everyday matte. I did reach into the Lethal Cosmetics Midnight Serenade eyeshadow palette twice this month. One of the times was today. I have this shade right here in the shade Starlight on the inner corner, and then the other time I reached into this, I reached into the shade Tempest, which is a really beautiful blue-brown shade. I also finished this, I think last month, No Pan Left Behind style, and it does make me happy that I, again, am continuing to reach for this eyeshadow palette, especially this is a newer palette to my collection, so I obviously want to be getting use out of new palettes to my collection, so I'm happy to continue to reach into that. And then the final palette I reached for 2 total times was my Nabla Cutie Nude eyeshadow palette. I was thinking this would be an easy palette to quickly No Pan Left Behind, and I haven't yet completed No Pan Left Behind, but I was also thinking, like, is this a palette that's like potentially on the chopping block? And I don't think it is. I don't think that it is. I think I'll end up keeping this one. So I have a few more shades to reach into from this eyeshadow palette to reach into it No Pan Left Behind style, but I'm hoping to do that soon so that I can have another palette completed for the year. Okay, you guys, I realized that I actually had 9 eyeshadow palettes that I reached for twice, and then 3 eyeshadow palettes that I reached for 3 times instead of 2. So the Rowan 75 Degrees quad, I only reached into this 3 times. I am working on this quad in my Rolling Project 10 pan, but I've said many times this is definitely more of like a fall winter palette to me. or like even like summer fall palette. I don't know, there's something about these warmer tones that they weren't speaking to me the first couple months of the year. I will say I'm feeling really motivated to reach for this at least like 5 times in April. I reached for this the other day and I really enjoyed the look that I was creating with it. So I'm excited to hopefully get at least 5 uses on this quad next month. Okay, this one might throw you for a bit of a loop, a bit of a surprise, but I reached for the Nabla Glorious Lights Glitter Palette 3 times, and I actually finished this No Pan Left Behind style. I mixed one day these 2 shades right here, but I was just reminded as to how much I actually really enjoy this pressed glitter palette, especially if I'm feeling extremely bored by a look and I feel like one of these shades kind of goes with the look. It really can just like take a look to the next level, and I'm excited about this. I also am excited to complete something else No Pan Left Behind, but this is something I anticipate I will continue to reach for throughout the year as well. And then the last palette I have at 3 uses is my Natasha Denona Biba eyeshadow palette. This is something that I was also working on in my No Pan Left Behind project, and spoiler if you haven't seen that update yet, but I have also completed this eyeshadow palette, which makes me so happy. I really enjoyed my time with this. I kind of wish that this rolled in the fall time, but the other part of me is like, okay, I already reached for it, completed it this year, and then I need to encourage myself to reach for it in the fall as well and get even more love and use on this eyeshadow palette, because I really do love the quality in this eyeshadow palette. I think it's absolutely beautiful, especially the mattes, and especially if I'm looking for something like just like a warm brown look. Even if I want to pair it with like a companion palette for a sparkly or more impactful metallic on the lid, I'm really hopeful to pull this back out and get more use on it when we reach the fall months, when I just feel like this palette is more appropriate to when I like to reach for it. So this one is complete though, and I reached for this 3 times in March. All right, moving on to the 4-use mark. I have 3 eyeshadow palettes. So up first I have one that I was testing out. I recently reviewed this eyeshadow palette in my testing the newest 11 palettes to me. This is from Diveroon Cosmetics, and it is the Gloomy Gardens eyeshadow palette. I reached for this a couple times also in February, but reached for it an additional 4 times in March. This is a really, really beautiful palette, a really fun color story. I like that it's kind of like grungy spring, and I absolutely love the 5 very special shades at the bottom. So I'm excited to continue to get used on this throughout the year, but I reached for that 4 times in March. And then the other 2 are going to be spoilers for my No Pan Left Behind as well, but I did reach for the the NARS Climax eyeshadow palette 4 times, and I did enjoy reaching for this. I feel like I was more creative in my mind, even though the looks were very neutral that I created with this eyeshadow palette. I feel like I was having more fun this time around. I will still say some of the mattes in this give me a little bit more trouble than I'd like, but I do absolutely love the 4 sparkly metallic shades. They're kind of like that chunkier, kind of thicker texture, but again, very impactful and metallic on the eyes. So I'm very excited that this is now a completed palette, and I reached for that 4 times. And then the palette on my eyes today, as well as one single shadow, is the Lethal Cosmetics Wildflower eyeshadow palette. And I was really motivated to also finish this No Pan Left Behind style. So this is another eyeshadow palette that I did reach for 4 times in March. The only eyeshadow palette I reached for 5 times in March was the Bella Beauté Bar Angles of Illumination eyeshadow palette. I've also recently reviewed this eyeshadow palette on my channel. I was absolutely loving the shade Sunlight down here. It looks like this kind of like gold to green sort of shade, but it really kind of pulls more of like a blue teal sort of green shade on the eyes, and it's absolutely stunning. And you guys know how much I love blues and blue browns, so I was really enjoying my time using this eyeshadow palette, and I anticipate this is another one that will continue to get quite a bit of use for me throughout the year, just because it's a really fun companion palette to have in my collection. All right, I have one eyeshadow palette I reached for 6 times in the month of March, and I'm kind of surprised because I don't necessarily remember reaching for this 6 times, but it's the Dose of Colors Friendcation eyeshadow palette. It does make me really happy I reached for this 6 times, because this is definitely a palette that's getting older in my eyeshadow palette collection, and I love this eyeshadow palette. So the more use I can get on this, the better. I swear this palette has been used and abused for me throughout its lifetime with me, and yet I still have no pans in this eyeshadow palette. I believe I reached for this shade a couple of times as an inner corner, and I would like to focus my efforts on potentially using this as an inner corner highlight until I at least have one eyeshadow pan in this palette. That might be a goal for April, but nevertheless, I did reach for this 6 total times in the month of March. For 7 uses, we have another new eyeshadow palette to my collection. This is the Terra Moons Cosmetics Space Chemistry eyeshadow palette, and this eyeshadow palette has 12 shades, 2 mattes, and the rest are very like metallic, sparkly sort of shades. So definitely more of a companion palette, which I believe is why it took me just a little bit longer to get my thoughts on this palette and to use every single shade in order to come back and test and review it. And so I will say, I don't want to spoil it, but this is definitely not my highest ranking eyeshadow palette from the recent palettes that I've tried. I just don't feel like the longevity is there with these shadows in terms of sticking on my lids all day, even with the glitter glue. I do really enjoy the Terra Moons shadows as an inner corner highlight. I actually do have a single shadow. I have Atlas on, like, topped on my lids today, and I love Atlas. I love Atlas. I love the Terra Moon singles, which is why I was so excited about this eyeshadow palette, but I was a little bit let down with this one. So that brings us to our 2 most used eyeshadow palettes, and if you guys have been following along just with my makeup journey this year, you can probably guess what my most used palettes are going to be. So for the 2nd month in a row, one of my most used palettes is actually I think the 3rd month in a row, it's the Baked Browns palette from Dose of Colors. I am currently trying to complete this shade right here, and we are so freaking close. I ended up reaching for Baked Browns a total of 18 times this month. And I don't even know if this shade right here has 18 uses left in it. So I'll be very curious to see how many uses this gets throughout the month of April. And then I'm gonna have to find another lid setting shade I wanna focus on. Like, what palette is next? And I will also say I did reach into this shade a few times this past month. So it's not necessarily just this shade that's getting used, but primarily my use in this palette is just that lid setting shade. And then finally, my most used eyeshadow palette throughout the month of March was my Danessa Myricks Groundwork eyeshadow palette, and I reached for this a total of 22 times. I use the shade Sculpted in my brows basically every single day that I'm doing my makeup. I think there were 2 or 3 days this past month that I just did, like, I did lighter makeup, so I just did like a brow powder, or not a brow powder, a brow glue and like a tinted brow gel. But aside from that, I was reaching into this eyeshadow palette every single day for the brows. I did reach into it some days to kind of play around with some of the other shades in this eyeshadow palette, and I'm definitely very interested in picking up the Groundworks Volume 2 in the Sephora VIB sale, so let me know what you think. I think there's some even deeper brown shades, or like, you know, shades that I feel like I could use for my brows in that palette, but I anticipate this will continue to be likely my most used eyeshadow palette until the entirety of Sculpted is used up. So I was very lucky to get this in my Beautylish Lucky Bag this year, because it has proven quite useful to me in my collection. But those are the 32 eyeshadow palettes that I used throughout the month of March, ranked by the amount of times that I used them. I would love to know what your most used and least used eyeshadow palettes were throughout the month of March. Let me know in the comments. Other than that, thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting me and my channel, as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.